How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're back in the world of No Rest for the Wicked, and looking at the title, we got a few things we need to go over in this one. First off, we're going to be addressing the nerf mentality in the community that seems to be running rampant in discussion. Second, we're going to be talking about solution to the armor issue we have in the game currently. Finally, crafting and enchanting needs a lot of love. I have quite a few solutions for these problems and a way to make the game feel a lot better, so let's talk about it. So first things first, to start this up, I want to talk about the nerf mentality of the community. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, what I'm referring to is that there are some balance or issues within the game that currently exist in No Rest for the Wicked. If you're a little bit earlier into the game, you may not notice these. But as you transition into the late game, you will see some of the problems with the game. Before we address those problems, because we will be doing that in this video, or at least some of them, there's a big problem where the community feels that in order to fix a problem, the immediate answer for pretty much a lot of players is nerf, 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 nerf. This is the nerf mentality that I'm talking about that I feel is very harmful to the pretty much the feel of the game. If you've ever played a game where the development team does nothing but nerf, 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 it starts to feel like the class or whatever the role is starts to feel really terrible until that class receives a mountain of buffs. Now I know some devs do this for flavor of the month kind of thing, so draw interest to other classes or take some away from others, but in a lot of cases, in my opinion, it always makes games feel much worse when you can do something like incentivize. But I do want to make sure that you guys understand something that I feel a lot of players completely forget as they're playing No Rest for the Wicked and weighing in their opinions on why things need to be nerfed. First off, No Rest for the Wicked is in early access, in very early access. That means we don't have all the in-game content that we're probably going to be seeing once we get closer to the end of the life cycle of the game. So a lot of players do feel like their power currently is way too high, and in turn they seem to want to nerf, 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 nerf because the player is way too strong. You have to understand that we're essentially Act 1 in the game. A lot of you are essentially taking what you're seeing in the very early game of the early mapping system. I'm gonna use Crucible and call it the mapping system, and thinking this is the end all be all. This is the peak of how difficult the game is going to be, how much we're going to see in the game. And I think that's just a flawed mindset, because yes, right now you're very strong. You can kill some of the in-game boss or the current in-game bosses in 15 seconds when you min-max your build and made it really good. Absolutely, you can, but you need to think about it as in, this is just Act 1. Of course you're going to kill the Act 1 boss really fast when you min-max your gear. This boss is never meant with the intention to be the strongest content in the game, and it very likely won't be. So for all the people who wants to nerf everything because you feel strong, keep in mind in a few updates you very well could be feeling very weak, and then it's going to be a total different discussion of we need to buff things because it feels weak, and it just creates a really bad vicious cycle in my opinion. Now that we got that initial nerf mentality discussion out of the way, because again I hate having to make this discussion because it takes away from what I think is really important to this video, and that is fixing the armor as well as the crafting system that has a pretty obvious problem, and let's talk about that now. And when I'm talking about the armor problem, I'm referring to players' choices when it comes to putting on armor. Currently in No Rest for the Wicked, it is very weighed towards armor as your defense, the armor stat, the physical reduction of damage from armor. It is very weighed that players will pretty much use it. It is significantly the most defensive stat in the entire game, so players will do their best to pretty much use it. On the screen now you will see 3 different tiers of gear, 1 light, 1 medium, and 1 heavy. The thing that makes these individual pieces of armor different is 2 things. 1, their armor value, obviously ranging from light to heavy. Heavy is going to have the highest armor, light is going to have the lowest. The next is going to be the weight. The more weight you have, obviously the more option for armor, the primary defensive stat in the game, you have. Now, seeing that armor is the defining defensive trait, yes, HP has value, resistance may have value, these other things, healing and stuff, may have value, but when it comes down to it, armor is pretty much the primary defense. Everything is way heavy towards armor. So what this means is players will invest a lot into equipment load and pretty much equipment load reduction to get as much armor, meaning light armor and medium armor is significantly less valued. I know someone in the comments is going to say I only use light armor, but most players who understands the game is going to pretty much use heavy armor because armor offers you the best defense. Now, most players who are not really thinking about it in a progressive way will say, well, the way to fix this is to make it more difficult for players to have armor or heavier armor, so make weight inconvenient. Now, this goes back to what I started with when it comes to the nerf mentality, where we try to make things feel bad rather than making them feel efficient. The reason why players go for heavy armor is because it is pretty much the best choice in terms of what you can get for defense. Players are inherently incentivized to reduce weight and get more armor. So how do we fix this? Well, rather than nerfing weight like a lot of players will suggest, incentivize other types of armor. So a very common thing in a lot of ARPGs is a implicit on an item. What this is, for players who are not familiar with, this is an affix that has a pretty much a deterministic stat on a piece of gear. In games like Path of Exile, they have this on different pieces of gear. So for example, a light piece of armor typically will have something like energy shield. A medium-ish type of armor will have something like evasion, as a heavier armor will have something like armor. Now, obviously, I don't know what the devs want to do when it comes to their defensive stat. Obviously, we need something other than armor being the primary defensive stat, because at the moment, armor would be way too much and it'll devalue light and medium armor. But to offer some solutions that could easily make it worthwhile for players to be incentivized, not forced, to want to use other things, is giving implicits on different pieces of armor. For example, let's say I have a medium piece of armor, I can give an implicit that has, and this is just kind of a number I'm throwing out there, it can be tweaked, 30% increased range damage. For the more hybrid armors that are maybe like, they look kind of spellcastery but still heavy, you can give something like spell damage and armor. It doesn't have to be a high value of armor, but like a lower value of armor with a lower value of like some type of magic based stat. And you can do this for every piece of armor. This in turn incentivizes players to want to go use other types of armor rather than just using the thing that has the best armor value. Now, of course, there's always going to be a player who just will stack armor and use that because being defensive is great, but there are a lot of players who are going to want to value having something that has a lot of damage, a lot of move speed, a lot of magic based things. So the point I'm trying to get at when it comes to like armor, instead of just forcing players to go for the heaviest armor or nerfing the equipment load like a lot of players would suggest, we can incentivize players to use other types of armor to make their build feel comfortable, and they're not forced to do one or the other. Of course, they can choose to do it, but they don't necessarily have to. They're incentivized to do others. Now, this actually helps in another way, and that is the crafting system. And when I say the crafting system, I'm talking about when I physically walk up to the smithy or like any of the benches and craft a piece of armor that I got a recipe for. Currently in No Rest for the Wicked, as far as I can tell from my playthrough and pretty much anyone I've interacted with, no one actively craft the gear inside the anvil or inside the leather working place. More times than not, we're buying the pieces of armor from the shop, or we're going around to farm it, because more times than not, there's no reason to use it other than the physical look of it, which again, I'm not going to do that because you have to enchant it and it's just going to be a bunch of mess, which we're going to cover in a second. So there's really no reason to actively go out, get the crafting materials and craft the armor. With my armor solution, this is a great way to incentivize players to actively go out of their way to go and, you know, pretty much do the things in the open world, get all the materials and come back and craft different pieces of armor, because it actually has those implicits that they may want. Again, we already have the armors that are ready to be crafted as it is. Giving them an implicit, in my opinion, fixes a good portion of the problems in the game where players are heavily weighing armor and not necessarily interacting with the crafting mechanic as heavily as they should outside of the weapons, basically to get the runes. Now, I really hope I explained this really well, because I feel like this is objectively one of the best ways to make the game feel good. We can incentivize players to actively try things out rather than trying to actively gimp them into not desiring to have heavier armor. But let me know down in the comments what you think. Now, finally, because I don't want to make this video too long, I don't know how long I've been rambling about the armor thing, but I did want to make sure that you guys understood it. Let's talk about the enchanting system in the game, because this is a thing I see a lot of players like mention whenever they're in the comments and we're talking about anything crafting related. The enchanting system in the game currently is a little too RNG in my opinion. Even if it wasn't too heavily RNG, I feel like a lot of things about it is very not good. The main being the disparity between rare and epic gear, or I call it epic because it's purple, but the cursed gear. One thing I like in a lot of ARPGs is the way that you determine the rarity of gear is based on the amount of affixes on the specific piece of gear, not necessarily what's on the specific piece of gear. I think that's fairly unique to No Rest for the Wicked. At least I've never played another game that have specific affixes that determine the rarity of the gear rather than the quantity, which is not necessarily the case 100%, as common gear is not necessarily have an affix on it, but it is statically common whenever it has no affixes. It's a really weird system between the rare as well as the cursed gear that I don't know if it works or doesn't work, but it feels kind of weird right now. And let's talk about solutions that I think can make it feel a lot better. First and foremost, when it comes to the cursed gear, I want to get this out of the way fast. Let's talk about the curses because they're kind of crazy. Sometimes they're just non-existent in terms of what they provide in terms of like negatives, and other times they're just completely like unplayable. To give you an example, a lot of the things that are experience based are just completely fine. They're good, there's no negative to them, and they feel pretty okay, except for when you're leveling, which is kind of counterintuitive to like getting gear in my opinion. The ones that are like experience loss on hit, those take like 100 experience off of every hit, and then when you have experience loss on death, it's like 500 or something. It's like whatever, it's super nothing. But you get hit 5 times leading into a death, and that's more than the experience loss on death. That one is unplayable until level 30, and it makes armor not good at all, which I feel like you should never want players to not want to use the loot they find. Looting is part of the most important things of ARPGs in my opinion, and if you can't use the gear purely because it's going to make you lose experience, I feel super bad. Again, if it's on death, I get that, that's fine, but every hit, that's ridiculous. Basically what I'm trying to get at is when it comes to the cursed affixes, they are very broad in how good or bad they can be. Some are just pretty much nil, where they lose a bit of your XP, a percent of your XP, as to where on the other end, it completely destroys your XP every time you hit. And I think we need to maybe take a look at some of the cursed affixes, and I'm sure you have the data where players just don't use certain pieces of gear and or delete it, and maybe tweak those. Secondly, a lot of the affixes are not very good, if that makes sense. You have a lot of situational affixes, for example, like 3% damage reflect, which is only going to be pretty much usable for reflect based builds, but are completely useless on any other build. Other things like stagger, poise, those kind of things are, I don't know if they even work if I'm being honest, but are kind of situational and not necessarily the best. And even more so, I notice on rare pieces of gear, they have 2 really good affixes that you can't get on cursed gear, which is percent armor and percent HP. Now, I feel like this is a massive negative to not be able to get percent armor and percent HP onto cursed gear. Part of the reason why I feel like defense is in a bad spot is because players can't invest that heavily into HP, because a lot of their points go into equipment load, a lot of their points go into stamina, and then stacking the stats so they can use it. I know I talked about the attribute system being reworked, and I don't want to make it about that, but I do feel like currently, if we had affixes that were like HP based or percent armor based, it would be nicer on pieces of gear so that just raw armor isn't as like pretty much sought out for. You can actually invest in HP and be a more HP efficient build. And even more so, I wish that the affixes themselves were a little bit better. I don't see why rare gear have 2 good affixes and pretty much everything else is pretty crappy. I know some people use stamina regen, but like in the grand scheme of things, that affix is terrible. In the grand scheme of things, like stagger resistance is either not working or very vague or not very usable in a lot of cases. So it's like you lock 2 of the best affixes, in my opinion, just in general in ARPGs, percent armor and percent HP, behind rare gear with pretty bad affixes that no one really wants. In the same vein, I do feel like the cursed gear typically have better affixes, but they're just not enough. A damage affix would be super nice. This is kind of why I led the discussion with Nerf, because I know a lot of players, if they heard that, if I didn't say anything about Nerf, they'd be like, we already have too much damage. Again, we haven't seen what the game fully has to offer when it's fully out, or even adding more updates. So a damage affix would really help a lot of things. It will help a lot of melee builds. It will help a lot of just range builds, and it'll give a lot more diversity rather than just, you know, looking for these few checkmark based affixes that everyone uses. Also, while I won't be covering it in this video because again it's already getting too long, I don't really like the fact that it's just click the enchant button and then you're given a random set of amount of affixes. I really think that it'll be healthier if there was like a currency at the end of a crucible or the end of whatever in-game activity that's actually supposed to be in the game that could in theory basically function as a crafting type currency. It doesn't have to be super difficult, or you can make it difficult or not difficult, I don't know. I can craft and tailor my gear. Of course, there can be a roll to roll, like a minimum to maximum you could get as an affix, but I feel like it'd be nicer if we can use that white gear and customize it to be significantly more tailored to the player. Now, while I am talking about enchanting, I did want to talk about just the enchanting, or ways to make the enchanting feel a lot better. And that is, initially when I first heard No Rest for the Wicked's like white common gear was going to be the most customizable, I thought this meant more than just slotting in a few gems and a few runes and just running in and fighting with it because it just has a lot of slots. That's not customizable to me. That's just like, I don't know, just not good to me. But ultimately, one thing I would love to see in No Rest for the Wicked, instead of our chests at the end of the crucibles or whatever the in-game activity is going to be whenever it inevitably come out, rather than having that secondary legendary that devalues many of the legendaries, in my opinion, significantly, and a ton of like useless white gear that comes in those chests as well. One thing that would be really nice if there was like some type of currency that can be used to craft on your armor that can only be applied to certain tiers of like gear. For example, if I have common gear, I can hit it with a currency that could in theory like put an affix of a specific type on it. So for example, if I'm a fire mage using fire abilities, I could have like a increased fire based damage affix. And in the same vein, as you progress it more and more, it will eventually get more power, and then it'll transform into maybe the rare type gear, the 4 affix gear. And then if you really want to push for another affix, or even making your affixes better, you can hit it with a curse currency and make it a curse affix. We already have the curse system in there, not necessarily like change up the affixes that's already on the specific piece of gear, or you could like, you can make them better or worse, or you can just gamble to get a new affix that could be good. Something like that would be good because it makes it so you players can actually tailor their gear a little bit towards their build, rather than what we have in the game now where it's just click enchant and get a bunch of random stats that may or may not like be towards your build very good. And they'll make the crafting system on the common gear feel significantly better, and again, more customizable. And I really want to be firm on this. It doesn't necessarily need to be easy for players to do it. It can be like, oh, I hit up with a currency that goes for a fire affix, and it can be fire resistance or a fire based damage buffing skill. You know, it doesn't have to be easy. It doesn't have to be hard either. It could be very simple and to the point. It just depends on what you want to do. Ultimately, I feel like the important thing is just making sure it feels customizable, so it's not just so RNG and boring, because I have noticed more and more of players saying enchanting is boring in the game and I wish it was just like this or like that. And you're going to start seeing more and more players have that same sentiment as the game progresses and more players get familiar with the end game and the enchanting system that we currently have. Anyway, I have been rambling on for probably about 30 minutes now. I'm gonna edit this video down to a more normal number, but that is gonna be my take on the enchanting, the crafting, and the nerf mentality of No Rest for the Wicked right now. I would really love to hear you guys weigh in on what you think about, you know, the whole situation, the whole talking point here. What you think could be good, what could be bad. Do you like my idea? What ideas would you like to add to it? Just let me know down in the comments, and I'll even have it in the forums, and maybe go check out the forum post itself. I'll have it linked down in the description or in the comment section for you to go maybe weigh in so the devs maybe can get their eyes on it. While you're in the description, don't forget to check out the Discord as well as the many other videos on No Rest for the Wicked. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.